All right, so you wanted to dive into some arguments for atheism. Well, we're going deep on Richard Dawkins' Outgrowing God today. We're looking at a summary of it, actually, but I think you'll find it pretty thought-provoking.
Yeah, Dawkins definitely doesn't hold back, does he? I mean, he really challenges those conventional beliefs. But by the end of this deep dive, you'll have a good grasp of his main points at least.
Ah.
And then you can decide what you think for yourself.
For sure, for sure. One of the first things that jumped out at me was his argument about geography and beliefs. He basically says, the religion you follow comes down to where and when you were born.
Right, yeah. That's his way of highlighting the problem with this idea of one true faith. Like imagine growing up in ancient Scandinavia. You'd probably be worshiping Thor and Odin, not the god of Abraham, right? It makes you think, doesn't it? Like, does your birthplace really determine what's true for you?
It kind of throws a wrench in that whole idea, yeah.
Yeah.
Dawkins then goes on to question the reliability of religious scriptures. He uses this telephone game analogy, to describe how biblical stories, for example, were passed down orally before being written.
Right. Think about how much a story changes when you whisper it from person to person.
Yeah.
And then imagine that happening over centuries.
Wow, yeah.
And he also points out that some key biblical events, like that Jewish captivity in Egypt, there's actually no historical or archaeological evidence for it.
Mm.
So it really makes you wonder about how literally true these texts really are.
Yeah, so not exactly divinely inspired then, more like interpretations of history filtered through the beliefs of whoever wrote them down.
Exactly, that's Dawkins' point. And then he gets into the morality of the God depicted in these texts. You know that story of Abraham almost sacrificing his son Isaac?
Oh, yeah. Pretty unsettling story.
It is, yeah. And he uses it to look at what he sees as a pattern of cruelty and violence, endorsed by this God of the Bible.
So is he just saying that the Bible has some strange stories? What's the point he's trying to make here?
He's asking a bigger question, really. If this God is supposed to be all loving and benevolent, then why does he command these acts?
It makes you think twice about whether holy books really provide a clear moral compass, huh?
Exactly.
Especially when you consider how much morals have changed over time.
Right, like think about slavery and women's rights. What was once considered normal is now seen as deeply immoral.
Totally.
So yeah, Dawkins is saying that relying solely on ancient texts for moral guidance, it might not be the best approach in today's world.
So if not God, then what? I mean, what does Dawkins say about the complexity and diversity of life? How does he explain all that?
Well, he uses this really interesting analogy to explain it. A termite mound.
Oh, okay.
Imagine these intricate structures built with no blueprint, no master architect.
I've always been fascinated by how termites make those mounds. So how does that tie into this idea of a creator God?
While each termite just follows simple, local rules. But together they create this complex structure. And he argues that DNA works in a similar way. It's a set of instructions guiding the development of life. From the bottom up, not top down like a designer.
Okay, so instead of a divine architect, it's more like a set of instructions. And that leads to all the incredible diversity we see in nature. That's a cool concept.
It is, yeah. And that's the basis of his argument for evolution, really. He uses examples to show how evolution actually works in practice. Like the flatfish. Have you heard of them?
Oh, yeah, those flatfish with the weird skulls.
Exactly. So they evolved to live on the seafloor, right? And over millions of years, their skulls twisted so both eyes could face upwards.
Wow.
It just shows how natural selection favors traits that help an organism survive and reproduce, leading to these crazy adaptations.
So no need for divine intervention then, just natural selection doing its thing over time. That's amazing. But I thought he also used a cheetah to illustrate this point.
He does, yeah. He tackles that whole intelligent design argument head on, using the cheetah's speed and agility.
Yeah, it's easy to look at a cheetah and think, wow, only a master designer could make that. So what does Dawkins say to that?
He says that what looks like design is actually the result of tiny mutations, filtered through natural selection over a very, very long time. Any mutations that help the cheetah run faster were more likely to be passed down, and that slowly shaped the species into the speed demons we see today.
So it's like nature is constantly experimenting, and the best designs win out. Okay, so where does religion fit into all this? If it's not a divine revelation, then where does this human tendency toward belief come from?
Well, Dawkins thinks it might be rooted in our evolution. He talks about how our brains evolved to be amazing pattern detectors, which was crucial for survival back in the day. But that same tendency can lead us to see connections where none exist.
Right, like our ancestors might have attributed a rustle in the grass to a predator, Even if it was just the wind. Better safe than sorry, right?
Exactly. And that same instinct that helped them survive might have also laid the groundwork for superstition. And eventually, religion.
He uses those pigeons, right? The ones that developed all those superstitious rituals.
Yes. Researchers saw these pigeons doing these random actions because they thought it would get them food, even though there was no actual connection.
Wow.
And Dawkins says, well, if pigeons can do that, imagine what humans, with our much more complex brains, can do.
Yeah.
We can create these elaborate belief systems based on patterns in agency that we perceive.
So he's saying that religion is basically a sophisticated form of superstition.
That's a question he explores in depth, for sure. And we'll continue to unpack his arguments in the next part of our deep dive. He wants us to think about whether this tendency towards religion is just a product of our evolutionary history.
Okay, well, I'm definitely curious to hear more.
Yeah, me too.
Last time we looked at some of Dawkins' main arguments, like how much our birthplace might actually influence our religious beliefs, and we dug into how reliable scriptures actually are.
Yeah, and we touched on how the morality depicted in those texts can be kind of unsettling sometimes, and how societal views on things like slavery and women's rights have moved beyond those ancient beliefs.
Right, and then there's that whole mind-blowing idea that DNA is like a set of instructions, building life's complexity from the ground up, not from some top-down designer.
Yeah, we explored how evolution, through natural selection, can lead to some pretty amazing adaptations, like we see in flatfish and cheetahs. It's a powerful process that can explain the diversity and complexity of life without needing to bring in a supernatural creator.
It really makes you rethink things, huh? So where does Dawkins go from here? Does he talk about that age-old problem of suffering and evil in the world? You know, it's a tough one to reconcile with the idea of a loving and all-powerful God.
He does, and he's pretty straightforward about it. He argues that the existence of suffering actually points away from a benevolent God.
Oh, interesting. So that classic question, if God is all good and all-powerful, why is there so much suffering?
Hmm.
What's Dawkins' take on that?
He suggests that all the pain and suffering in the world, both human and animal, it's hard to square with a God who cares about our well-being. Natural disasters, diseases, even predator-prey relationships in nature. It all involves a lot of suffering.
It's a different perspective than what you usually hear from religion, isn't it? You know, that suffering is a test of faith or part of some bigger plan.
Exactly. Dawkins says that if a God did exist and allowed all this suffering, he'd have to be either cruel or powerless to stop it. Neither option really fits the traditional image of a loving God.
So then what's the alternative? If it's not God's will, then why is there so much suffering?
Dawkins thinks it might just be an inevitable consequence of a universe governed by natural laws. He says we tend to anthropomorphize nature, like we give human emotions and intentions to a universe that's ultimately indifferent to us.
So it's not that God is choosing to inflict suffering, it's that suffering is just a built-in part of reality.
And that's basically his argument. He says that accepting this reality, even though it might be uncomfortable, is a more honest and realistic way to see our place in the universe.
But doesn't that make life seem kind of pointless? I mean, if there's no grand plan or purpose, what's it all for?
That's a good point, and Dawkins addresses it. He says that not having a predetermined purpose doesn't automatically mean life is meaningless. In fact, it can actually be liberating.
Liberating, how so?
It frees us from being tied to some predetermined plan. We can create our own meaning and purpose. Instead of searching for meaning that's been imposed on us, we can decide what matters most to us and live our lives accordingly.
So we have the responsibility and the opportunity to define what makes life meaningful for ourselves, instead of looking to a higher power for answers.
Exactly. Dawkins believes that taking on this responsibility is empowering and fulfilling. We can live authentically and build a life that reflects our values.
But if we're rejecting traditional religious beliefs, what about morality? I mean, religion does provide a moral compass, right? Guiding us towards doing good. So what's the alternative?
Dawkins disagrees with the idea that morality comes from religion. He thinks morality comes from our evolved ability to empathize and reason.
So instead of following divine commandments, we can use our own human abilities to figure out right from wrong. But does that really work? I mean, there are plenty of people who do bad things without religion being involved.
He argues that even though people are definitely capable of doing bad things, our capacity for empathy and our ability to think about the consequences of our actions, that gives us a foundation for ethical behavior. He points out that cooperation and altruism aren't unique to humans. You see those behaviors in the animal kingdom, too.
That's true. Animals don't have religious instruction, but they still show what we consider moral behavior. Does he give any examples of how a secular morality would work? I mean, it's one thing to say morality doesn't depend on religion, but how do we deal with all the complicated ethical problems in today's world without a set of rules from God?
That's something he explores in detail, definitely. And in the last part of our deep dive, we'll look at his vision for a secular, humanist future.
Well, we've covered quite a bit in our look at Richard Dawkins' Outgrowing God. We've questioned that whole one true faith idea and looked at how reliable scriptures really are. We even tackled the problem of suffering in a world that maybe doesn't have divine intervention.
Right. And we explored Dawkins' argument about DNA, how it's like a set of instructions for building life's complexity, from the bottom up, not from a designer, and how evolution, through natural selection, can explain those amazing adaptations we see, like in flatfish and cheetahs.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride for sure. So now I'm really curious, what does Dawkins propose as a positive vision for life without God? I mean, it's one thing to criticize religion, but if you're taking away that whole belief system, what do you replace it with?
That's where he brings in this idea of humanism. He's not offering a rigid set of rules like some religions. It's more about a worldview grounded in human reason, ethics, and a shared responsibility for making the world better.
So instead of relying on faith or divine revelation, humanism emphasizes our ability to think critically and be compassionate to guide our actions, I mean.
Exactly. Dawkins argues that humanism offers a more compassionate and fulfilling way to live. It encourages us to find meaning and purpose in our relationships, our work, our pursuit of knowledge, our contributions to society.
It sounds like a very down-to-earth approach. Instead of looking for answers in the supernatural, we focus on what we can do to improve our lives and the world around us. But what about the things that religion traditionally provides, like community, rituals, traditions? Do those just vanish in a secular world?
Dawkins recognizes that those things are important, but he says we can find secular versions that meet those needs. For example, instead of belonging to a church, you might find community in a local group, a volunteer organization, or even just a group of friends who share your values.
I can see that. And what about rituals? They seem so deeply rooted in human cultures, often with religious origins.
Yeah, Dawkins suggests that a lot of rituals have evolved. Beyond their religious roots, they have new meaning in a secular context. Think about graduations, weddings, even holiday celebrations. They can still be meaningful and connect us to our shared human experience, even without the religious stuff.
That makes sense. It seems like Dawkins is advocating for a more mature and thoughtful way to live without God. It's not just about rejecting religion, it's about actively embracing a worldview that celebrates human potential and our ability to create a better world through reason and compassion.
Right, he's not saying we should become cynical or anything. He sees it as a more fulfilling way to live,
Yeah.
grounded in reality and driven by the sense of shared responsibility.
It's a call to action, really, to shape our own destinies, find meaning in what we value, and work together to build a better world. It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
It seems like Dawkins' vision of outgrowing God isn't about giving up belief entirely. It's more about evolving how we understand our place in the universe, embracing our ability to think critically, be compassionate, be creative, to shape a more meaningful future.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Outgrowing God by Richard Dawkins. We've explored some challenging ideas and wrestled with big questions about belief, meaning, and morality. If you want to explore these topics further, I highly recommend checking out Dawkins' book. It'll definitely spark some interesting conversations and maybe challenge some of your long-held beliefs.
As always, the important thing is to keep an open mind. Keep asking questions and keep searching for your own truth.